breaking down the IAM standards that shape how identity works. This is Decoded, by Identity at the Center.
So welcome to Decoded by Identity at the Center. My name is Jeff Steadman. You may know me from Identity at the Center podcast. This is a new thing that we're doing here on the channel to get more deep into the standards. I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Sean. Hello, Sean.
How's it going, Jeff? Sounds weird
not
hearing your other co-hosts like, how are you doing? Good. How are you? Good. So yeah. I'm well.
A little bit of a non-standard intro. This is us trying to figure it out, right? And building the good ship Decoded as we're sailing it down the high seas. What is this podcast for, Sean? I know we're doing it under, Decoded by Identity at the Center, but what does that mean in the real world?
So in traveling at Identiverse, Authenticate, and different conferences, everyone's always asked, like, we want the next layer. Not like the layer that you have to read like an archived white paper, but like, how do you make it practical and pragmatic? And I think that's the middle piece of linking together like what you put out in your podcast center, but then like how do you start linking it together? Because I'm a huge proponent on standards will set you free, bet on standards, centers give you interoperability. I think this is that niche to say, let's connect the dots, let's start chaining things together, how it answers a lot of deeply technical questions, but to bring it up the level of like understanding, because we can go into an hour on one topic, but this is meant to give you both depth and breadth at the same time.
So we're going to focus quite a bit on standards. I kind of see this as a little bit of a spiritual successor to Vittorio Bertocci's Identity Unlocked, who unfortunately he passed away a couple years ago, but he had a great podcast. Go back and listen to those. But the idea here is to kind of dig deeper into those standards. Now, I am not an identity standards person. I don't write them. I read them. I watch them and I look for them from an integration standpoint. But the whole reason you're here, Sean, is to help with that, as well as our guest, Pieter, to like talk through, okay, what does this mean in the real world? And so the idea is to kind of set the stage. Okay, why is this important? What is it we're focusing on today? How do we do it? Like, that's how I really want to kind of get out of this conversation, because you're going to be educating me just as much as everyone else who's listening that maybe, isn't a standards expert. Is, okay, so what is this thing? What does it do? How do I use it? How do I make this real in the real world? And that's kind of what I'm hoping to get out of it. Does that make sense, Sean?
100%.
Okay. The very brief answers. I appreciate that.
No, it's very well put together. I mean, let's dive. I'm ready to go in.
So what are we going to talk about today?
We're going to talk about agentic identity, and mixture of authentication, authorization, and like the whole stack of like agentic identity, agentic auth, agentic authorization. We're going to get into like control planes with gateways, and maybe even how we get into continuous evaluation, not CAEP. There will be CAEP in here, but it'll be continuous evaluation, so you can get to like that whole, the buzzwordy continuous governance loop end-to-end assurance. But Pieter and I are going to help break it down into actual practical terms, so where it isn't going to be like a architecture slide, or, it'll be real.
And there's standards out there to support that. So we've got things like SPIFFE and OAuth and shared signals framework. You mentioned CAEP, right? Risk and WIMSE and a whole bunch of like other alphabet soup that we're using. But let's go ahead and choose our...
It's almost there. Build the whole bingo card, right?
Yeah, I would say do a drink every time you hear an acronym, but anybody in IAM would tell you like, yeah, you're not going to make it like 5 minutes without being completely off the rails, if that's the case. But yeah, there's a lot to cover here. So let me introduce Pieter Kasselman. He is the VP of Open Standards at Defakto. Welcome to the first ever Decoded, Pieter.
Well, Jeff, thank you. It's great to be here, and what an honor to be the first guest for this new podcast. So maybe a little bit about myself, VP of Open Standards at Defakto, chair of the WIMSE working group, one of the alphabet soups, also frequent contributor, regular contributor to OAuth, and longtime identity enthusiast. And so I think identity have really come to the fore over the last sort of 5 years. And certainly I think what we're seeing right now in terms of the sort of agentic side of things, really shining a light on this space. And we've been working on standards to help secure identity and making identity interoperable for a long, long time. And really talking a little bit about today, how you can actually benefit from all the standards work that's been going on for more than a decade and how that's really ready for use. Yes, there's gaps, but I think the thing that I really want to talk about today is you can get really, really far with the systems you already have and with the standards that's already in place. And that's really kind of the focus for today, for me at least.
We don't need to wait for things to be embedded or anything else. It's like an assembly problem. It's putting things together and let's go, honestly.
Yeah, and it's all about just having the right framing, right, and the right framework through which to look at this. And I think when we get into it, we'll talk more about it. But I think there's some really interesting, like when you start looking at this, and you look at this whole AI space, and you just remember that you're dealing with a piece of software that's running somewhere, somewhat non-deterministic. We'll talk about authorization. You can get a long, long way, right? Agents are workloads, and once you understand or appreciate that, all of these tools that we've been building for a decade or more suddenly becomes very applicable.
So let me ask a quick question here. We're talking about AI agents and authentication and authorization, but in my mind, this isn't a new thing. Right? We've had non-human sort of identities for a long time, right? Service accounts, all kinds of stuff that have been around forever. What is it, why is it important that we start to get this going now? Like, where do we, what is it? It's like, hey, okay, is it just the scale? Is it the speed? Is it, what is it that's like, wow, we better get our handle on this like now compared to 5 years ago or 10 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, what an excellent question, right? I think when from talking to practitioners like Sean and others in the industry, right, my observation is this. First of all, the scale is going to be very, very different from what we're used to. And a lot of when people talk about non-human identity and they talk about things like service accounts, etc., what they really did is they borrowed human identity concepts and they just sort of manually, it's all a manual workaround to make it work for these non-human actors. That is no longer a scalable problem or scalable approach, right? That's just not working anymore. So the scale. The other thing that's really becoming clear why we need standards in this space particularly is cross-platform. Peter's law of agentic utility. The more cloud services, the more platforms an agent can access, the more useful that agent becomes. And agents are expensive, and so you want them to be as useful as possible. And that means you need to have an identity infrastructure or identity capability to connect everything to your agent and for your agent to connect to everything and do that securely. And this is what standards kind of enable for you. So I think there's sort of the whole we used to talk about multi-cloud, really multi-platform, right? Because the other thing is, right, the cloud vendors will talk to you about the cloud, but they'll never talk to you about your on-prem environment. And everybody still has significant on-prem, right? And those things need to be connected. And this is critical for getting value out of your agentic investments. I think the other thing that's happened is the threat landscape has significantly changed, right? I think when you look at how, like, we've been spoiled for up until with a very benign geopolitical environment with, things have been bad, but they're about to get a lot worse, right? I think, and thinking about how you harden your infrastructure and making sure that your agent, that you know which agent you're running, that agent is running in a correct environment, that it is acting the way it should, and making sure that you have some form of authorization and control over what that agent and your other non-human actors can do. I think that's another absolutely sort of critical thing. And then, I think the last two things that I always sort of think about, really, I think one of the challenges that we see, right, with existing infrastructures, it was really not optimized for these environments, right? It was really not built for automation. And the absence of automation, having humans interact with these things, make these systems incredibly brittle. One of the things that I think frequently gets forgotten by security and identity practitioners, but security practitioners, availability. Remember the old CIA, confidentiality, integrity, availability? Availability is part of security. And if you're not automating, your risk of outages goes way, way up, right? Especially when it comes to things like credentialing, identity proofing, and so on. And so I think I think a lot of these problems, Jeff, to your point, we've recognized it for a long time, but I think we finally, it's now become really the wolf is at the door, right? We either make this leap or we get overwhelmed with managing service accounts by hand and manually rotating secrets forever, right? That's a terrible future for all of us. Nobody should have that in their life.
And everybody does a really good job of it today. So I'm sure nothing bad can happen when all of a sudden it exponentially grows the number of accounts you're trying to manage, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think and I think the industry is responding in a good way, right? But you're right, and I think I'll go out, API keys is sort of the one of the first things that we really need to get rid of in this new agentic world, and the cost of not doing so, you have no way to control where that key goes. Once a developer or an engineer or a system has control over it, it'll show up in all sorts of ways. And these days, right, when I steal an API key, I'm not just stealing access. I'm stealing permission to use your budget. And I can exhaust your LLM budget very quickly, right? And so these things there's real financial implications now, right? It's not just a thing about, I'm going to get a fine or I'm losing customer trust or any of those things. It's no, there's a bottom line, right, when you do that. And I think the other thing about API keys that then happens, of course, is when you want to go and say, I had a problem, or I have to rotate that key, or I'm revoking that key, you're going to cause outages. And an outage, right, if you're a large Fortune 10, Fortune 500 company, your servers go down for an hour, that's millions, tens of millions, maybe more, right? It's a lot of money that's at risk. And so I think that's kind of almost step one. But and that's just on the authentication side of things, right? But you asked about what changed. I think it's this new environment: speed, multi-cloud, new new security threat environment. Really.
Yeah, I think you hit a lot of stuff I was going to layer onto here, but the way to look at it from an engineering standpoint is this is distributed system design on steroids. It's insane because you have to factor in financial, business. So if you're an SRE, system reliability engineer, this is right up your alley. But again, the multi-cloud piece, the interop, the federation, if you will, it's so important because most big companies are not going to say I'm all in on X platform. Because there is a shift that I think I'm seeing is a lot of sensitive things are being moved off of cloud service providers and onto their own data centers and using their own models. And how do you cross talk? The answer is not going to be, here's my API key, here's your API key. That can't be it. To Peter's point, it can't be.
No, please let that not be the case, right?
No, but I think that is a good natural segue into one of the first big topics of the deep dive is agentic identity and identifiers. Right, Jeff?
Yes, absolutely. What does that mean? What is an agentic identity identifier?
Well, let's take a step back first, right? I think when we think about agentic, I think one of the interesting things that I've realized is we have all these standards, and we have standards about agentic or around identifiers, right, for non-human entities, etc. But one of the things that, as Sean and I have been talking, and others have been talking over the last couple of months, is one of the challenges is really creating a mental model for people about how do all of these things fit together. And so I think the first one is, okay, right, you must have an identifier. If you don't have an identifier, there's no way you can reason over any access that this thing has to have, right? There's no way you can really do any authentication. And so so the first thing that I think in any sort of agentic or AI identity management system that you're going to need is you need to be very clear about what your identifier is, right? And then once you have an identifier, we'll get into details of each of these, but once you have an identifier, what you really need to think about is, okay, how am I going to present that identifier? And this is where you get into the credential discussion. You're going to need an X509 cert. You're going to need a JWT. You're going to need a workload identity token, right? But you need some way to cryptographically bind that token in. Sean, you've got your hand up.
I do not. So I will lower it.
Oh, all hand. Okay. And so you have this credential, right? The next thing is, of course, right, okay, I now have a standard for my identifiers. I know how I'm going to present it. How do I decide, right? How do I decide what identifier to assign to what workload, right? And this is where you get into, think of it as identity proofing of the workload, right? There's a workload running. What is the attestation process, right? How do I figure out that that workload is running in the right environment? It has the right bill of materials. It has the right, is running on the right hardware. And then based on all of that information, I decide, okay, I'm going to give it an identifier, right? I'm going to assign an identifier encapsulated in a credential. So that attestation/identity proofing step is sort of the next thing that your system needs to be capable of. And once you have that, right, you also have to figure out, like, how do I get that identifier and credential to my workload? Because the workload doesn't wake up and know its identifier and credentials, right? It's going to wake up and it goes like, oh, who am I, right? And basically, this attestation process happens, and then you go back and you say, okay, this is who you are. But you need to deal with that last mile provisioning, and that actually needs to be highly, highly robust. Now, we'll talk more about SPIFFE and how SPIFFE-like systems really enable that. And now you're at a very interesting point, right? Now you have a workload with credentials. You've got some trust in that set of credentials. Now that workload can authenticate. So now this workload can call, or that agent, right, can call this other agent and say, hey, this is my identifier. And the other agent can now do an amazing thing. It can make an authorization decision, right? Or there's an authorization layer that makes the decision for the agent, right? So you go from identifier all the way through to authentication, and now you can make authorization decisions. But of course, right, and I think a lot of today authorization is very, typically very static. And I think one of the things we really have to assume now is that your authorization is not static, it's dynamic, right? And I think, Sean, you've talked a lot about this concept of dynamic authorization, right? This idea that the authorization state changes on you all the time. And this is where you sort of do, somewhere in your next layer in your architecture has to be about, okay, I can authenticate, I can authorize, right? There's different ways to do that. But now, how do I collect all these signals? And then when the identity threat assessment changes, how do I feed that back? How do I change the authorization state, right? How do I even go as far back to say, stop issuing this credential because these workloads have been compromised, right? And I think that's a very important part of closing that loop, is this dynamic identity concept. And then, of course, on both sides of that, there is, for each one of those things, you're going to have a set of rules. This is my rules for identity, authentication, authorization. And on the other set is compliance, right? You're going to measure against your policies, right? And this is kind of a way to think about your, this is a framework, right, with which you can sort of look at agentic identity. And the key insight here is, right, if you would start filling out, okay, so which standards do I use for these things? The key insight is workloads. Agents are workloads. And now you can use all the workload identity and workload and traditional standards that's already capable of dealing with non-human entities. You can now actually start filling out that architecture. So that's kind of, I'd say, a framing for this. And this is actually exactly the thing that we wrote up in what people now refer to as the AIMS draft. I think officially it's called the AI Agent Authentication and Authorization Draft. And it really introduces this concept of an AI management system. And then all it does is describes how do you map every standard that is relevant to this framework so that you don't have to go and invent everything new and can just use the things that's basically off the shelf and available.
and I'll have a link in our show notes for people to check that out. I prefer AIMS. That's easier for me to pronounce than AI Agent Authentication and Authorization Framework.
I think we may have to change the name of the draft. Who knows, right? But I've certainly seen people refer to it as the AIMS draft frequently.
So Sean, what Peter's describing sounds an awful lot about the plumbing that works behind this idea of continuous identity. Is that accurate?
Accurate. So continuous identity was pretty much a foundation to get the human stuff ready, so that when the agents or the bots come, we're ready for it. But it is, in principle, it's zero trust at every layer. It's ephemeral, verifiable, workload bound identities at every hop. You have to have it at almost every hop, and it's just doing the human-like IAM things at scale. But I think Peter alluded to it, and I won't. We should rehash it now. We have enough to cover as is. But the security and business implications here are immense. They're immense. But yeah, 100%.
This is the goal, right? We've been talking about with things like zero standing privilege and zero trust for forever, it seems like, but it's probably only been like 4 or 5 years in the real world. But this is how it gets done. So let's dig deeper into how that works. So Peter, you kind of alluded to things like SPIFFE, SPIRE, shared signals, and other sort of open standards, right? And I love the idea of trying to get this right now because we're sort of at that beginning part of it. But let's start with, well, where should we start? Is it the identifier layer? Do we get into things like WIMSE, or do we want to start somewhere else?
Yeah, let's build that way, right? I think it makes the most sense, and it sort of gets us through this whole stack. And so in the draft, and by the way, I should add, like this draft, as we're sort of, I think we've got a total of 6 authors right now. So we've got folks like Brian Campbell from Ping and Aaron Parecki from Okta, Jeff Lombardo from AWS, Yaroslav Rumashako from Zscaler, and also Nick Steele from OpenAI, right? So we think that's a fairly good representation across the industry working on this draft. And Sean, of course, have been contributing and giving us all sorts of really good pointers and tips, and writing the occasional PR even. So thanks for that, Sean. But yeah, let's start with identifiers, right? So I think when it comes to identifiers, in the WIMSE is the workload identity for multi-service environments working group in the IETF, and it was specifically chartered to focus on this workload identity space. One of the things that WIMSE defines is it defines a WIMSE identifier. We've actually broken it out into its own spec. WIMSE also sets and defines a set of modern authentication mechanisms, which we'll talk about a little bit more later on. But it really provides this kind of framing. WIMSE is also very specifically we are very mindful in the WIMSE working group to make it compatible with SPIFFE. So SPIFFE is a Cloud Native Compute Foundation project. It stands for the Secure Production Identity Framework for Everyone. And WIMSE is really an encapsulation of SPIFFE. And so in SPIFFE, there is something called a SPIFFE identifier, which is a URI. And it is the SPIFFE standard is very opinionated about what makes a SPIFFE identifier. WIMSE is taking a slightly broader view and says, well, there are SPIFFE identifiers, but there's also other kinds of identifiers, right? And so WIMSE sort of provides this slightly broader set of definitions, and WIMSE really defines the identifier as any URI, which can then be profiled. And so what that means is every SPIFFE identifier is also a WIMSE identifier. And so that's one of the ways in which we sort of keep these systems compatible. Jeff, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, so I hear this term quite a bit when we talk about interactions, is the word opinionated. So when you say something is opinionated, for the people who aren't following along, like, I have opinions, does that count? Like when you say opinionated in the standard, like what does that mean?
Opinionated in the standard means there are very specific rules that a group of people argued over for many, many months and finally agreed that this is the opinion that they all agree on. And this is how something typically is constrained, right? This is how we're going to constrain identifiers for this kind of deployment. So that's what we mean by opinionated. Of course, everybody is welcome to have additional opinions, but the one in the document is the one that you're going to have to deal with.
So we drive consensus through that. I love that. So yeah, please carry on.
Okay. And so these two things end up being compatible in this way. So I think I'll talk more about SPIFFE identifiers for a moment because they have been very broadly deployed, right? I think SPIFFE as a system or SPIFFE implementations, there are some of these deployments out there. They are issuing 1 billion credentials a day, right? These are things that operate at enormous scale. And so the SPIFFE identifier itself, it's a URI, it's hierarchical. It contains things like a trust domain. So credentials issued within the trust domain is encoded in this URI. And then in the path section, you can have sort of additional rules and use that for namespace management and things like that. Different deployments, again, some deployments are opinionated about how they like to use or how they want to format their identifiers. But by and large, you actually have quite a bit of flexibility in that, right? And it gives enterprises a lot of control. And so that's just the identifier side of things. Moving on from identifiers, right? These identifiers then gets encapsulated in credentials. And SPIFFE defines using a JWT, JSON Web Token, which is a very common kind of authentication mechanism. It's a bearer mechanism. It is way better than any static API key because it's at least short-lived, it's scoped. It can only be presented to a certain audience and so on, right? So it actually, it's like it is a huge step up from API keys, even though it's a bearer token. Then beyond that, right, the other credential type is X509 certs, which makes sense. Like you want your workloads to be able to do mutual TLS, right, and authenticate that way, and do that at the transport layer, at the networking layer. JWTs are more often used at the application layer. And then one of the new things that WIMSE is actually introducing in this credential space is the so-called workload identity token. Think of it as an X509 cert in JSON format, right? So basically, you now have not only a set of claims about the identity of the workload, but you also have a key that's associated with that workload. And now your workload or your agent can actually use that at the application layer to sign transactions and to create things like HTTP signatures or WIMSE proof tokens. I'll talk more about that when we get to the authentication layer. But essentially, these are sort of some of the new credential types, or two of them widely deployed: workload identity tokens, about to drop off the production line, already being adopted by SPIFFE. And we expect that to just sort of find that's going to progress over the course of the next couple of months, by the end of the year, hopefully. From a WIMSE perspective, saying this optimistically as WIMSE chair, I hope to see significant progress in that specs moving to completion.
I feel like I need to give kudos to all the acronyms here, because we've got WIMSE, SPIFFE, SPIRE. We've got a new one I'm hearing, maybe Workload Identity Token. We can call that one WIT. I mean, these are way better acronyms than like the normal like IGA and PAM and things like that.
I think it's the difference between engineers naming things and analysts naming things, maybe.
That's fair.
could be. So anyway, so this is kind of things that's happening at the standards. And so far, you would have seen that we've not had to invent anything new, right? And so if you go back to our first premise, which is agents are workloads, it's like, well, give your agent a SPIFFE identifier or a WIMSE identifier, and then make sure that it has one of these credentials, right? And typically, right, when people say, oh, but which credential should I give it? This is sort of to an earlier point in this conversation, right? Provision it with the credentials that your existing system knows how to handle. right? So there's no point in giving X509 certs to your agent if none of the protocols or none of the systems that your agent is interacting with is capable of dealing with MTLS, right? If your agents need to interact with OAuth servers, give it an X509 cert, give it a JWT, right? Your authentication server knows how to deal with those as authentication credentials. And so I would sort of encourage folks to think about, right, when you have to decide which credential type, this is all about compatibility and interoperability. However you're protecting your existing system, this is how you deliver. Make sure you deliver those credentials to your system.
Hey, Peter, I think you said something that's really important. Connecting SPIFFE to OAuth is very, very important now. It's uber important.
I'm really glad you're bringing that up. And there's another spec that we have introduced in OAuth that I will also, we'll share a link for that as well. But it's basically SPIFFE authentication with OAuth. And it's things that you could always have done, but we're now making it very explicit. And again, tying this back into the agentic side of things, it also defines how you use client ID metadata, the CIMD spec, with SPIFFE, so that you can dynamically register, and you don't have to pre-register with every OAuth server. We're getting a little bit ahead of things because really, when we get to authorization, we'll get into that even more. But really, like setting the stage around, you need these credentials to be connected, and then they become really important when you hit the authorization layer, right? Like that's where because that's where you need these credentials to be authenticating with. The next thing up is the provisioning side. So this is actually something that SPIFFE does really, really, really well. SPIFFE provides this. So one of the things that SPIFFE does that is different from traditional human identity systems is it issues short-lived credentials, right? And the key insight is that for humans or human identity systems, identity proofing is traditionally very expensive, right? When you show up at a company for the first time, people will spend a lot of money to ensure your identity. They will go and create an account, and they'll give you a password, and they say, Jeff, Sean, do not lose this thing, right? And so that is an account plus shared secret. And then, of course, it turns out that that's bad advice, or not bad advice, but it doesn't work like that because, the next day you arrive at the train station and somebody is trading chocolate bars for passwords. And guess what? Like that chocolate bar is very attractive, right? And so, and then we had to invent MFA, right? This is where the whole MFA thing comes from, because the thing that we give you, you're going to lose control over that, right? Same as with API keys. What SPIFFE's insight was, it's like actually, or one of the interesting insights about SPIFFE is the cost of identity proofing for a non-human actor, a workload or an agent, is very low, very cheap. You can do that every time this thing runs, right? Every time I show up at my corporate office, people can't do an identity proofing on me. Like that's going to be, you can't run the background check and check my bill of materials. That's not like too expensive. But for your workload, you can. And for your agent, you can. And so because of that, right, now it means you don't have to create these long-lived service accounts. And you don't have to provide long-lived secrets that you hope your agent is not going to lose, or the developer developing the agent is not going to lose, right? So what SPIFFE does is it says, we will automate this attestation identity proofing step. We will establish the identity. We will provision the credentials. And you don't need to have any secrets, right? And that's kind of part of this automation and deployment trick that makes SPIFFE very, very, very compelling. And that's how that's how you get to provisioning and running 1 billion credentials per day. Is it's all automated, right, through this process. The other thing that it does on the provisioning side that you need to think about is when you're issuing these short-lived creds. One of the beautiful things is when you're doing let's say you're issuing a new credential to a workload every 5 minutes, you're not going to do that with a human, right? You have to automate it. And so basically, when you go down this path, you're always automating, and there's no humans in the loop for any of this. And as a result, you also don't have these outages. So many practitioners folks that we talk to, they will tell you that their biggest problem with deploying some of these human identity systems for non-humans is the outages, right? And so again, availability is a big part of it. And SPIFFE has this concept of renewing and keeping your credentials up to date all the time. Sean?
Yeah, I think you hit on something pretty important here. Practitioners that I've talked to at various companies, I rather said, yeah, I had to bundle in service accounts into my workload, or service accounts plural. And it moves us backwards from the end goal. Because then to your point, Peter, it's like, well, I got to rotate that password. And it's like, oh, you just killed 15 agents doing 15 things. This answers that problem. And it actually, from a business context, it reduces a lot of the account sprawl that we see. Because a lot of companies look at it as oh, I have to share credentials now with my agent to get my workload, to get my work done. The answer is, sure, you can do that. That's bad. Or you can do this SPIFFE thing. Like it actually works. It does. And it's very, once you see it in action, it is very like eye-opening, and the applicability just runs through your head like, oh, I can do this now and that now. And it's just, it's very foundational to the entire chain of agentic control. It's very, very, very foundational.
That's a fantastic observation, right? And I think just think about how it changes even how you think about governance, right? You no longer have these service accounts standing around. You no longer have these secrets you have to manage. It really is sort of this. It's a real example of what happens when you really rethink and understand the problem you're solving versus just trying to band-aid over the thing with whatever you have, right? And so I think that's sort of the next thing, Jeff, is really thinking about that provisioning cycle. And I think if I had guidance for folks around that, right, SPIFFE actually provides these mechanisms, let's call them runtime provisioning, right? Capability, keeping your credentials up to date, etc. I'd say whatever you're doing in that space, be very thoughtful. Think about keeping these credentials short-lived, right? Leverage the fact that you can dynamically attest to their the provenance. Think about how you can tie that back into your vulnerability lifecycle management, right? Because one of the things that when you're running and you're doing that identity proofing bit, guess what, right? You're tying back to your bill of materials, right? So suddenly you can start looking and say, oh, well, I have a vulnerability, workloads that are using this library, not getting identities until we patch them, right? They have to be on the right version before they can go, right? There's things like that you can start thinking through, or it gives you power and control, right? To Sean's earlier point, right? You want a control system for your agentic environment? These kinds of things enable it.
Let me ask a question here, Peter, because it kind of goes on to provisioning. You mentioned like what happens if, someone loses, this, what is the path for an agentic identity that has been provided this identifier? Can you lose it? How do you tie them together? And I'm curious, when you mentioned this whole identity verification, right? I think you were referring to, and maybe you were going to get this, is the SPIFFE verifiable identity document, or the SVID or SVID. Can I have multiple of those? Like, is this just another thing that needs to be correlated back to sort of a accountable identity somewhere, or am I still thinking in human terms and this needs to be a different layer of abstraction?
No. So in this system, every actor, every agent, every workload has its own unique identifier, and it has its own unique credential, right? And you can have multiple. You can have an X509 cert, you can have a JWT, you can have an X509 cert, WIMSE identity or workload identity token. You can have multiple JWTs, right? Because you're going to be accessing multiple workloads. So if I am one workload, but I need a credential to access or to authenticate to GCP as one example. And then I need another credential, and it's audience, right? Your JWT has an audience, but then I need to access something in Anthropic. And so I need a different audience. So I have a separate one for that. And so you end up with a sort of set of, but it's always the same identifier. And so you can correlate, right? Think about that. Now when you think about governance, you say, oh, I have this one agent. It has this identifier. It accessed all these systems, and the way I know is because I can look at the identifier in the credential and all these systems that got identified. And isn't it weird that there is, like, why is it trying to access this other system, right? Because even just like, oh, access failed, it's like, oh, I know who tried to access that because I can look at the identifier, right?
Yes.
And so you can have multiple of these things. Sean?
So Peter, you're going exactly where I think organically the conversation shifting next is. This is no different than a human being. When I log into my laptop in the morning, I go access application A, I get a token. Application B, I get a token. It's the same concept, it's just the scale. But you said something that your provenance and your traceability is huge. And this is where, like, most companies are starting to throw out the lovely buzzword agentic gateways come into play here. I think where you're going with this, Peter, is very, very prominent right now because you almost have to know pre-intent, pre-tool call, or pre or post-intent, depending upon the use case, but pre-tool call to know, should you even let the agent go where it needs to go based on its scope and purpose? And that's where you're getting into the next part of the lovely, fun conversation.
Yeah, authentication, authorization, right? So, I think let's quickly just talk about authentication. The beauty about having these credentials, as Sean pointed out, it's like you can now you can authenticate to all these different systems, but authentication is not authorization, or at least usually it's not. And if you treat it that way, you're probably going to have some nasty surprises, right? So you do want this extra layer. The beautiful thing about having unique identifiers with which you can authenticate is you get this traceability, but you can have authorization logic that is specific to that identity or to that identifier. And I think one of the other things that's interesting is you can now have agents act as themselves or act on behalf of a user rather than an agent impersonating a user, right? And so I think those are really important distinctions. The thing that Sean talked about earlier, right, where people say, oh, I've got an agent, I'm going to give it my credentials, that's impersonation. And that is, in my view, quite a dangerous pattern. It's also an understandable pattern, but it's quite a dangerous pattern. A pattern that I think works better is delegation, right? I, as the user, have an identity and an identifier. The agent has an identifier. I am going to delegate to the agent, and now the agent can act on my behalf. And there's sort of... and the good news again, right? People say, oh, that's going to be terrible. No. Yeah. It turns out this is what OAuth actually is, right? I think a lot of folks think about the OAuth protocol as, oh, it's an authorization thing. But in reality, it's an authorization delegation protocol. And when you look at it, what you do with OAuth is you, as the user of the web browser, delegates authority to the browser to act on your behalf and call APIs. Right? So back to our earlier insight, workloads, agents are workloads, right? A browser is a workload. You can use the same protocol. You can use the same constructs. And OAuth, even when you look at just like the JWT-based access token, it already makes provision, right? It has this concept of a client ID, which represents the piece of software making a call, and it has the concept of a subject, the user that delegated to the client, right? Now, one of the challenges, of course, is that when people implemented OAuth and deployed it, they never wrote any authorization logic to reason over the client ID, right? And so that and so I think there's a discussion that needs to happen around that, right? That is something, but there are ways to deal with that through gateways and various other things. But that the core premise of delegation, authorization delegation, is what OAuth has been doing for the last 15 years, right? I think that is and of course, the OAuth ecosystem is huge. And so if you're in this space and you're thinking about agentic identity, there's a couple of, and this draft that we talked about actually outlines this as well. There's a couple of OAuth specs that's really important, right? There is, of course, the authorization code flow. That really should be the default that you use for users authenticating. For agents acting on their own, things like RFC 7523, the jolt authorization grant flow, right? Those are really, really critical, and also gets you a little bit out of some of the registration challenges. And then some of the new specs emerging. Client ID metadata, I think, is really important for dynamic registration. So that's another one that I would say you definitely want to know about. A third one, or a fourth one, is the on behalf of. People talk about on behalf of. What they really mean is, I need proof that this user and this user delegated to this agent. Now, that's either an access token, or the other pattern that you can use here is you say, well, I'm going to do an on behalf of or a token exchange, right? And so you use OAuth token exchange and say, I have this token, give me back another token that has these additional information about who the subject and the workload is, right? So that's sort of the fourth one that you really want to know about. Then there's two others that I'm going to quickly talk about that is they're about to be finalized. I'm co-author for both of them, so I really want to see them done now. The first one is transaction tokens. And so one of the things that we've observed, and this is again it's kind of an anti-pattern in the up until sort of the 2020, 2023 period, where when people get an access token, that access token is typically, it's called audienced for a specific resource server. But what then happens is that access token gets forwarded throughout the system so that all the downstream services can know who the user was, what scopes they had, and what did they delegate, right? The problem with that is you're wide open to a thing called token theft. And so this is what SolarWinds and various other headline events have been about, was threat actors figuring out that if I steal the token, doesn't matter how you authenticate. I have your token, and now I can do anything. And of course, the more places in your system these access tokens are, the more places they can be exfiltrated from. And that has been, like, token theft's been a huge headache, right? And so one of the things that we've introduced as a result of this is this concept of transaction tokens. And so transaction token says, when you receive an access token, don't give it to someone else. Take that access token, go to your transaction token server, which may also be your IDP, and basically request a transaction token that ties all the information in that access token specifically to an individual transaction so that it cannot be used outside of that transaction, time limit it, downscope it, and augment it with additional authorization information, IP addresses, time of day, transaction limits, things like that. All the information that your downstream systems will need, but now at least when that transaction token, as it travels through your system, somebody steals that token, they can't re-enter at the front door. They can't even replay it in the transaction, right? Because this thing is tied to a specific transaction, right? So you don't have this, your risks around token theft is drastically reduced, right? And certainly you can't use it with a different transaction, right? You can't go and change and say, oh, this was a $100 transaction, I'm going to turn it into a $1,000 transaction. Can't do it. It's a cryptographically protected token. So transaction tokens is another one. The other specification that I want, Sean.
Yeah, you're hitting on like Like, I love transaction tokens. And I want to, for everyone listening to this or watching this, both mediums, I hope, Jeff, tying together transaction tokens with the whole chain is important. And here's why. Think of it as access tokens on the outside of the gateway, transaction tokens inside the gateway. You're like, what the hell? What does that mean? It means that any service call you're going to make is bound to context and reason. Peter, you said time. I'm all for that. But if you're looking at this mature and greenfield, maybe even a little brownfield, the gateway is going to have every request and response the agent makes. So when the response comes back, you can just kill the transaction token and make it moot at that point. So it is so important here. And why is this the most, probably the best piece of it is every service on the call chain gives you who initiated it and or what agent's calling it, what is it constrained to, and you're not even doing least privilege anymore. You're doing zero. And why does it matter? It's this governance thing, right? It's you get a fully baked in audit trail for the agentic era in the transaction token itself. And it was very hard to not use the acronym Mr. Campbell told me never to use again. So I'm going to say transaction tokens the rest of my life. But I just wanted to point it out that it's so pivotal to get that right. And it's like, well, there's this new tech, it's this new way to talk. Transaction tokens are a form of JWTs. So again, not recreating the wheel, just staring at the wheel saying, look, it's a wheel over here and it's a wheel over here.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, one of the things that is very interesting about transaction tokens, of course, is like the rate of, we've seen so many adoptions of it already, right? It's actually, I'd say adoption is outstripping the ability of the spec to get finished at this point. We're seeing more adoption than getting the spec finished at this point. But spec will be finished. We're working on it. It's a very high priority because we're also beginning to see specific profiles of the transaction token spec for agentic use cases, right? Where, again, other folks, practitioners are, Jeff, to use the earlier word, they're becoming more opinionated about how a transaction token should be used in an agentic deployment, right? And I think that's actually incredibly helpful, having practitioners come back and say, well, this is how we use it. This is what we've seen. Two more things on the OAuth side for folks to look out for. Identity chaining and cross-domain authorization is a key spec. It's being profiled. So Aaron Parecki and I think Carl McGuinness and Brian Campbell are profiling that spec right now for what they call cross-app access. And that's a key specification in the agentic space as well, right? And it really allows you to have the user authenticate once, or have the agent authenticate once, but then having the sort of cross-app access so that the user doesn't have to go and authenticate to each individual service and grant authorization to each individual service. It's also actually really critical for the transaction token side of things. And so that's sort of a thing that Sean and I have been talking about as well is, okay, if you have a transaction token and you need cross-domain access. How does that work, right? And transaction tokens are meant to be used within a domain. And the trick is, if you want to go cross-domain, you use the identity chaining spec, right? That's the glue that allows you to access services in other resources in other domains. If you have a transaction token and you don't have an access token for that other domain. The final one that I'm going to talk about, which I think is really going to do a ton, not just for agentic, but just for everybody that has a client ID and a client secret deployed, is the OAuth, the SPIFFE authentication for OAuth draft. And again, I'll share a link to that. But that specification is really writing down things you can already do to a large extent, but really being very explicit, right? Again, being opinionated about how this would work so that we have better interop. And that is really going to allow you to use those SPIFFE credentials that you've provisioned, right? To replace client secrets at the very least. And you can use it with CIMD if you still need traditional client IDs. So that is on the OAuth side. And I think let's talk. And so I think the other thing I would say about the OAuth ecosystem, it is wildly rich. There's over 100 specifications in that ecosystem. What we did in this draft, the AIMS draft, is really to say, here are the ones that you really, really should care about. I mean, the OAuth ecosystem is rough for people who spend all their time in it. If you're a newcomer to OAuth, you kind of need here's the cheat sheet, right? Here's the guidebook for how to navigate that. But of course, as I've said earlier, right, having done authorization or authorization delegation is not enough, right? The reality is your authorization decisions change over time. And this is where things like secure signals framework and ideas around dynamic authorization come in. And Sean, this is kind of sort of looking at you as one of the pioneers in this space. But really, I think one of the things that when we put this together was this acknowledgement, right? Authorization is dynamic. It changes over time. SSF provides you with a set of messaging standards and protocols for how to communicate that information throughout your system. Sean, I don't know if you want to add more to that.
I think you're spot on, and this is where elements of the stack that you can see in, are we calling it the AIMS framework? I don't want to disappoint you, Peter, but the AIMS framework right now, or whatever acronym comes to mind, is it gives you the I hate being cliche, but like the reactive fabric of like, oh, context changes. Like, we shouldn't let an agent do something to a system if there isn't an open change ticket, not by a human being, but just because there's a window saying we can't do it. That's one example. But it's more around shared signals framework gives you the ability to enable real-time revocation and propagate it across all dependencies in the stack. And it isn't just going to match it like if you implement it at work. It's the protocol and mechanism so that when you're talking to many gateways, because we're going to have to in the agentic world, you need one centralized, again, one more buzzword, PEP, policy enforcement point. The gateways should either look to one policy enforcement point, that way you can tie in all your signaling into that. So your gateways just become traffic cops that say yes, no. And then, like Peter said earlier, depending upon architecture and layout, your transaction token service can be your IDP, its own thing. It could be part of your open ID provider. It could actually even be part of your gateway or gateways. Again, all yeses with pros and cons. But your gateway is like your middle ground. And we didn't talk about it here because there's so much depth in the gateway that you can get into, like model poisoning, agents, what you're allowed to use, no hugging face, tons of stuff there. That in itself is its own thing if you want to actually decode that.
Yeah.
Pun intended, Jeff. But what does it give you in this stack? It gives you more real-time monitoring of your environment and ecosystem that you hook up to a graph, to some data points that say the business might have shifted and changed and it's reactive and you have to ship it somewhere so that we know about it, because there's business and there's security context. So I'll give you an example is if you have an autonomous agent, for example, the gateway could receive a CAEP event, CAEP, continuous access evaluation profile. You now can downscope or revoke tokens mid-flight. And there's a new concept that we haven't talked about yet called identity brokering, but that's where you could stop minting tokens for that agent and revoke all sessions or transactions or instances without writing a policy, intervention, or calling the SOC level 1, level 2 and saying, listen, this thing shifted, kill it mid-flight. And it's literally because data came in and said, this agent's acting rogue, because we've seen too many requests, like Peter said earlier, like you're trying to access the system 4, 5, 6, 7 times. And heuristically, it's like, you've never asked this. Something's weird. Don't kill it, just turn it off and see what's happening. That is kind of like saying I hate using this word, but the system tightens itself automatically based on ever evolving and ever changing conditions. And I think that piece, integrating it into all layers of the stack, is so important. And it's not vaporware anymore. It works. It works in prod right now.
I feel like this is probably a good spot to try and hopefully make this real, right? We've been talking a lot about like how this fundamentally works, from like a spec, standpoint. Can we kind of transition to, okay, that's cool, Peter. How do I do this? What does this look like in the real world? And Sean, I'd love to hear your thoughts, because obviously you've built some of this stuff as well. But how do we make this real for the people listening?
Well, I think so everything that we've talked about have real world deployments, right? You can use these things today, right? You can go and you can deploy SPIFFE. There are open source options. There are commercial offerings, right? And we see this. We talked about the scale at which some of these things run. Billions of credentials a day at really large, very large companies. This is not a theoretical thing. You can do that. You can provision those SPIFFE credentials with X509 certs and JWTs, and in the near future they'll have workload identity tokens, and you can use them. And you can use them with OAuth to do these delegation scenarios today, right? Token exchanges are well supported. Several IDPs do support them. You can use SPIFFE credentials with OAuth. Auth Lead actually supports that. Keycloak supports that. And I believe you can actually use SPIFFE credentials with things like Ping and Okta as well, right? Like you can use these credentials with existing IDPs. And so that's already there, right? So it's really there. I think there are things that you may have to do in terms of, like, to Sean's point, right? You may have to put a gateway in place because it gives you central control, right? You may want to have that gateway in place specifically because you don't have the time to go and update every bit of authorization logic you have to reason over the claims inside an OAuth access token. And you do have to integrate with your existing authorization systems, right? We didn't talk about policy-based access control, RBAC, ABAC, REBAC, all of these things. They're also deployed out there, right? And this is very important. The OAuth access token is one input to your authorization decision. It carries really important information about the subject and the agent. But that's not the end of the authorization decision, right? There's this whole other set of authorization machinery, and that's often some integration that's needed. There are standards like AuthZen emerging that should make that easier, but that's pretty real. And then I think, Sean, our friends at Signal have been implementing some of the SSF concepts, at least. You can probably speak more to that. But I think one of the observations, Jeff, is like this, everything that we talked about here, it's not theoretical, right? You can already do these kinds of deployments. You just actually have to know that you can.
Peter, you hit on something that's pretty important. Policy-based access control. There's a lot of opinions out there about reback, pback. There's starback pretty much right now. I don't want to add to the acronym salad here, but looking at this from a governance lens, but even a GRC lens, there is no human way to scale this. No human way. And the only thing that makes sense to say is all HR-based agents can get access to these 5 systems. That's scoping it. And then you can go one level deeper and say all HR-based agents who were tasked with being a monitor can do right to this. That's a policy. You have to look at it from a policy perspective, because if you do it at the instance level, you can't. I mean, happy to be wrong, but I don't, unless you have money here's the money tree, you can shake it. It's like it's coming down, but I don't see it. I don't.
No, I agree. When you deal with singletons, you're going to fail because the scale is going to overwhelm you for sure. I think that I 100% agree. The other thing, Jeff, that I would say is we're not living in a fixed world, right? I think one other thing up until, if you asked me this question last Monday, I would have said, you can deploy these things, but, right? when you're calling Anthropic, for example, you have to have an API key. Turns out, as of last Tuesday, that is no longer true, right? And so I think what we're also beginning to see is this shift happening as these agentic platforms is finding more deployment in enterprises. The reality sort of arrives, right? And it's like, well, you cannot just have API keys. And so I think last Tuesday, Anthropic introduced Workload Identity Federation. And so now you can have one of these SPIFFE credentials and you can go and you can authenticate your APIs in Anthropic without having a pre-established secret, right? That's pretty huge. And so I think the other thing is that I would say, I think, Sean, you raised this point maybe earlier when we were talking, having a conversation with your providers about the capabilities that you need to run your enterprise securely. You absolutely have to do that, right? And because that's when it becomes like, oh yeah, of course, you cannot scale, you cannot deploy, you cannot govern, you do not have control. And then the question is, well, how do you do that? And it's like, well, there's a standards roadmap or a standards blueprint that's mostly there. It requires maybe a feature addition here, an extension there, right? A capability that needs to deploy it as part of a gateway or deploy a gateway, things like that, right? But I think our earlier point, I don't think we want to say, oh, we've got it all, but 95%, right? There's a huge amount that you can just pretty much use off the shelf, and for the rest, talk to your providers, right? Especially if it's a deployment blocker.
The foundation's solid. It works 100%. Another good one you mentioned, Anthropic, is Google announced Agent ID, and it's based off SPIFFE. It's great. So those of you who were in Google deploying anything on Vertex or in different realms there's no more service principal service agent. It's just you now hang entitlements off of an agent ID, and it works great. And I think the next layer is interoperability, because most big companies aren't all in on vendor platform X, Y, and Z. It's the lovely F word, not that one. Federation. Like, how do you talk? How do you interop? And a lot of vendors are missing that boat. And I think as practitioners or as executives or product folk or engineers, be vocal. Be like, how do I talk to this over here without having to spin up another account or an API key? Like, I want one way. Have to.
Yeah, that absolutely right. That law of agentic utility. This is a very expensive retooling that every enterprise is going through. And everybody should be insisting on getting value from it. And you're going to get the most value out of your agents if it can actually access all the information across all your cloud and on-prem environments. And to your point, Sean, like, I think there is no such thing as a single platform environment anymore. I remember talking to somebody about this, and they were telling me, it's like, oh, Pieter, we don't need cross-platform. We're a single platform company. And then 6 months later, they came back and they said, well, we were a single platform company, and then we acquired this other company, and now we're a multi-platform company, right? So M&A, like, I think nobody lives in a single platform world anymore. It's great that every platform is taking identity seriously. But to Sean's point, right, if we really want to unlock the value of agentic use cases, we're going to have cross-cloud and cross-platform access. That's going to be the key. And that's all identity, right? Agentic identity is going to be the thing that non-human, good old workload identity, that's the thing that unlocks it for you.
And Jeff, I know we probably should wrap. I just want to say one last thing as a practitioner is, if you look at this from an agentic lens, agentic workload lens, you can go backwards, and this works for machine identity, which they are different. I will debate that all day on LinkedIn with anybody if they want to debate it. But how you do this for machine identities and agentic ones, it works both ways. And if you do it, if you figure out the hardest use case with agentic, it works for machines. And if you do it the hard way, the users come organically. I'm not saying for free, because they don't come for free, because it's just organically it does. It's very interesting how AI has compressed the time frame to figure out the classic IAM problem. Who has access to what? where and why, and it's should they have access to the right resource at the right time for the right reasons. Replace the who with the what, put them together, and you have nirvana.
If you build an easy way to do it, that's where people will come. So,
Ooh.
that's the way to do it. Like it's, I won't take this down the product path. And when I say product, I mean like vendor. What I mean is like this idea of having WIMSE, SPIFFE, SPIRE, and SSF, right, combined, that as the product of how you do agentic identity. Like that's the way that, at least right now, as of the year 2026, this is the way we're approaching it. And if those are standards, they're built, they're ready to go, and people will use them, right? That becomes the methodology that and the framework that people should be using and adopting going forward.
Yeah. The pit of success, right? I think that this is the picture we're trying to paint for people. It's the pit of success. You're going to fall into this thing. Everything else is to be harder. That is, I think, absolutely. And that is the benefit of reusing stuff, Jeff, right? Building on the work of the last decade, you're going to get so much further. And if you think it's hard to deploy infrastructure that's been around for a decade, wait till you deploy infrastructure that hasn't been built yet, right? That's way harder.
I'm just going to have AI do it for me, and I'm sure it'll work totally fine.
Who knows? Maybe that is the answer, right? But there's also evidence to suggest that could come with adverse outcomes sometimes.
Yeah, I've seen The Matrix. I know how this ends. We're batteries. That's the way it ends up.
You spoiled the
Hopefully
ending.
we can do
I didn't
better.
see The Matrix, Joe.
You know what? It's been 25 years, I think. I hate to say it, but I think if you haven't seen it by now, chances are you probably aren't going to. All right. Anything else that we want to cover? Like, Pieter, this has been very educational, at least for me, and I hope for others as well. Like, what's the main takeaway here? Like, if I said I just got into an elevator with my CISO or CIO or somebody who's in charge of helping facilitate this at the executive layer, give me like the 30-second to a minute elevator ride of how I can explain this to someone and try to get their buy-in.
I would say the key to solving your agentic AI identity challenges is to realize that agents are workloads. And the moment you do that, you have 95% of the problem solved because there are standards and products that implement those standards available today off the shelf. The remaining 5% are gaps that the industry is actively filling. And then there's an integration aspect, right, that you may want to go and look at. And this is where things like gateways and other kind of architecture, deployment architecture comes in. But it's not, I think the tools are there. The products are there. The gaps are being filled. And, what's that? I have this saying from St. Francis of Assisi, right? Start by doing what's possible, right? Or start by doing what's necessary, and then you can start doing what's possible. And before you know it, you'll do the impossible, right? And we already have all the tools to get us to possible, and possibly even some of the things we thought in the past was impossible. The tools are there.
That
was a great LinkedIn post, by the way, Pieter.
Yeah, that's the
great LinkedIn post.
way to do it. Sean, how do you want to end this? Like, do you have any words of wisdom for people out there?
I think
or not wisdom. That's fine too.
Oh, I know. I'm just trying to think about it on top of my head, but it's more around this is not far from reach. Even if you do two of these things, you're better. You build on it little by little. And I think if I were in an elevator with a CISO, I'd say, what you don't know should bother you. Like there's blind spots to agents all over the place. And it's just going to take one hiccup and you're going to be, no one wants to be on the front page of the news. No one wants that, right? But grounding it in truth that identity is a first party principle in agentic workloads, that is the most true statement on anywhere. That should be that is a prime directive in anything to do with AI. If you don't have a registry or a catalog of what's doing what, you're blind. The takeaway from this is the standards are there, they're real. Are they perfect? One would argue kind of, they're getting there, but it's enough to say you can't look at your leadership and say, well, they're still evolving, we don't know yet. I think that time's gone. It's there. It's now. Going and doing it now is the right approach to take. And it isn't vaporware. You're not wasting money. This is legitimately, standards will make AI palatable. Because you don't want to reinvent the wheel with, a new model, a new this, I gotta go No, it's base primitives. Here's your control plane, your data plane. Layer on all the new stuff, won't matter.
That's such an interesting observation, Sean. It's a pattern that I've seen emerging over the last 6 months. And another bit of guidance: decouple your identity plane from your platforms and your frameworks, right? And I was at the MCP Dev Summit talking to folks, and it was really interesting to see how many folks are arriving at this conclusion. It's like, I'm going to be on multiple platforms. I need to decouple my identity layer, because otherwise it's going to be impossible for me to actually achieve the outcomes that I need.
Look, there's so much to pick up here. We're going to have links in our show notes. Peter's been kind enough to send over at least one. I'm sure there'll probably like 40, but send them over my way. We'll include them in our show notes for people to take a look at. If you get a chance to have these conversations, please do so. Not everybody in IAM is a developer, and not everybody who is a developer is in IAM. And the only way this works is if we start asking questions. And I think for the people who are out there as like IAM practitioners that are in charge of some portion of their identity security, is go out and start asking these questions. Some of these problems have been solved. Some of them are being solved actively, right, in the industry. So start asking questions. How are we doing this? How are we protecting the workloads? How are we handling authentication, authorization, for these agents? There is a lot of information kind of out there, and these are the types of questions that you need to be asking. So I know I learned a lot today. I especially learned that we have some really great acronyms, especially in this space of the world. We're getting smarter. May we, just focus on making acronyms funnier and people, funnier or more interesting, and that'll help drive people towards this whole thing as a product as well. So. Peter, I appreciate your time. We'll have a link to you as well in our show notes so people can reach out, if they have questions. And then, Sean, I think this is something you and I are going to do from time to time. It's kind of the standards approach, get a little more detail into it. I don't know where we're going to go next. Have you thought about what our next Decoded episode is going to cover?
I think so. I think it's either going to be a mixture of, I have some feelers out for transaction tokens as the next follow-up, the deep dive. The other fun one I think we can get into is, I want to say consent, but that's a very dirty word right now. But I think transaction tokens have a lot of applicability coming up relatively soon. So reach out to a few people who are interested in talking. So I think it's going to be transaction tokens more than likely next.
Okay. And that'll be something to look forward to. And then if you've got suggestions out there for areas you want to take the standards conversation or whatever, send them to Sean and or myself. LinkedIn is probably the best way to do that. I will have LinkedIn connections for us as well in our show notes. So yeah, that was our first Decoded by Identity at the Center. Hopefully people enjoy that. Hopefully people learn something. And we'll talk with everyone in the next one.
That was Decoded by Identity at the Center. Visit idacpodcast.com for more digital identity conversations.